This is example one looking at a study on adverse effects of smokeless tobacco. So we're going to look at this study and identify some variables and see what we think of the outcome. So a study on adverse effects of smokeless tobacco used 40 college students as subjects. 20 were given smokeless tobacco to chew, and 20 were given a placebo of some sort. The students were randomly assigned to one of the groups. The students' blood pressure and heart rate were measured before chewing and 20 minutes after. A significant increase in heart rate occurred in the group that chewed the smokeless tobacco. All right, so first things first, what type of study was this? Observational or experimental? And let's go back to the previous section here to look at the difference between those two. So remember that an observational study is just observing and recording things. Data is collected in a way that doesn't interfere with how those data arise. There's no influence by the researchers. In an experiment, different groups are assigned to different treatments. So in this study, we've got an experiment because there is influence by the researchers, and we are assigning different treatments to different groups. So this is experimental. Okay, and we'll note here that this is experimental because a treatment was applied or given. Oops, applied. There we go. Now, what are the explanatory and response variables? So remember, in an experiment, we're trying to show if there's a connection where the explanatory variable can explain the response. So response is the outcome, explanatory is what we're manipulating. So explanatory variable here would be the thing that we're manipulating, prescribing treatment here. It's whether or not the students are chewing actual tobacco. Okay, so whether or not a student chewed tobacco. Okay, because we had those two different kind of treatments there, tobacco and then versus the placebo group. Okay, so the answer to that explanatory variable, like did they get tobacco, yes or no, will have an impact on our response variable. That's the outcome. And that's what we're measuring. So yeah, remember response variable, this is what's measured for changes. So what are we measuring? Blood pressure and heart rate. Blood pressure and heart rate. Okay. Next, which was the treatment group? So treatment group here is referring to not the control group. So let's put that in as a little definition. So not the control group. Because who would the control group be? The ones that got a placebo. So not the control group is the ones who didn't get a placebo. It's the students who were given actual tobacco. So the students chewing actual tobacco. Okay, Now, a consideration here. Could the students' heart rates be affected by knowing that they're part of a study? Now, pause for a second and think about what you think here. Do you think that this could be affected? I think potentially they could, potentially. Because especially with the nature of this study, chewing tobacco, maybe there's some hesitation or some sort of nervousness about it, or sometimes people just get anxious knowing that they are being looked at as part of a study. So I think there is some potential there, like if students are nervous or anxious to be part of this. Um, but it probably would not have that big of an effect on the results. Because it should be pretty equal across both groups. This sounds like it is a blind study, even though they don't explicitly say so. The students are randomly assigned, and I would bet that the researchers are not telling the students which group they're in. So it should be a fairly equal effect across both groups. Okay. Now, if you have other thoughts on that, um, come talk to me. Let me know. I mean, there are different ways to answer here. So that's what I think. There's also different ways to answer on this next one. List some possible confounding variables or lurking variables, as they can be called. And this is, open for different answers here, because this is a study in humans. Humans are incredibly complex. So some that I've thought of here would be if students are already used to tobacco or nicotine. So that's kind of a big one. Do they have a tolerance already? Could have an impact for sure. So already a nicotine or tobacco consumer. Oops. That's the biggest one I could think of. Um, Other things might be if maybe a student has some underlying medical condition that would cause them to have more of an effect, a greater impact on blood pressure and heart rate. We'd have to see, are all our students generally in good health there in this study? Um, Age could have an impact. All right. Since they're just general college students, there could be a range of different ages there. And, you might think of some other ones. If you come up with one that you really like, send it my way. All right. Now, last, do you think this is a good way to study the effects of smokeless tobacco? Well, what I think is it sounds like their experiment was fine. So, they randomly assigned the students. They had a control group, they had a treatment group. Sounds like, they kept it a blind study, maybe not double blind. So they could, do that if they wanted to up the ante a bit. Um, but overall, the experimental design sounds fine here. Now, how this question is phrased, it just says, is this a good way to study the effects of smokeless tobacco? That sounds really general, the way that that's put. Like, study the effects of smokeless tobacco on anyone and everyone, which is not really what we're doing in this particular study. The fact that this study was just done with 40 college students is a pretty limited population that we can generalize these results to. We are just focusing on college students. So, for effects of smokeless tobacco overall, Would not say it's so great. So I'll just say population studied is limited, since we were just looking at college students. You couldn't necessarily say these results are going to generalize to, retirees or, well, I hope we wouldn't test on like kids, but older adults, things like that. This is just looking at college students. So if we're studying the effects of smokeless tobacco on college students, sure, this seems fine. But to say overall, maybe not so much.